Seraphine Voss learned the price of her name on a Thursday night in November. She had come downstairs for a glass of water, nothing more. The house was quiet, the way old houses go quiet after midnight, settling into themselves, creaking softly, exhaling. She wore wool socks and an oversized sweater, and her hair was loose around her shoulders, and she was thinking about nothing in particular when she heard her father's voice coming from behind the study door. She stopped walking. She did not mean to listen, but the words came through the old wood, like they were meant for her. "She will be ready by Friday," her father said. "You have my word." A pause. Another voice, lower, colder, one she did not recognize. She had better be. The Ironclaw Alpha does not wait. Seraphine stood in the dark hallway with her hand on the wall and her water glass still empty, and understood, in the slow and terrible way that real things are understood, that they were talking about her. Her father, Alpha Doran Voss, was selling her. Not in those words, of course. The paperwork would call it a peace arrangement, a treaty offering, a diplomatic gesture between packs. But Seraphine had spent 3 years working as a pack mediator. She knew what the language meant when you stripped it down to the bone. She was being handed to the Ironclaw Pack, the most powerful and most feared pack in the eastern region, in exchange for a debt her father could not pay any other way. She went back upstairs. She did not get her water. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and did not cry, because crying would have meant she was surprised, and she was not entirely surprised. She had watched her father make hard choices her whole life. She had simply never been one of them before. By morning, she had packed one bag. She packed it practically: documents, medication, 2 changes of clothes, her legal credentials. She did not pack photographs. She did not pack anything she would be tempted to look at and feel sad about. When the car arrived at the front door, she walked to it herself. She did not wait to be collected. She did not look back at the house. Ironclaw Estate was large, clean, and cold in the way that expensive things are sometimes cold, as if warmth had been deliberately removed to make room for something more impressive. The grounds were enormous. The security was quiet but visible. The staff moved efficiently and spoke only when necessary. Seraphine was given a room on the 2nd floor with a window that looked out over a stone garden. The room was nicely furnished. The door had no lock on her side. Beta Kane Holt introduced himself the first morning. He was tall and well-dressed, with pale eyes and the careful smile of someone who had practiced it. He explained the arrangement in clean, professional terms. She was a guest of the pack. She was to remain on the estate grounds. She was welcome to the library, the garden, the dining room. She was to attend formal dinners when requested. "And if I have questions about the terms of this arrangement?" Seraphine asked. Kane's smile stayed exactly where it was. "You may direct them to me. And if I want to leave?" A pause, very short. "You are a guest," he said again, and left the room. Seraphine sat down at the small desk by the window and opened her notebook and wrote down everything she had observed in the first 6 hours. She wrote down names, schedules, which guards rotated at which times, who spoke to whom in the hallways. She wrote down the layout of the ground floor, as she had seen it during the walk from the entrance. She wrote down Kane's tells, the slight tightening around his eyes when he was choosing words carefully, the way his shoulders moved when he was about to redirect a conversation. She was not going to be passive. She was not built for it. She also was not going to be reckless. Reckless got people hurt. She had learned that from watching other negotiations go badly. You did not fight a locked room by throwing yourself at the door. You studied the hinges. So she studied. The news that the Lycan king was coming reached the estate on a Wednesday, and the effect was immediate and unmistakable. The staff moved faster. The guards stood straighter. Kane, who was always controlled, became very still in the way that people become still when they are working hard not to show that they are nervous. Seraphine heard the name in pieces. Calum Draveth, king of the Northern Reach, the oldest Lycan bloodline still living, and filed it away the same way she filed everything else. Useful, possibly very useful. She did not let herself think beyond that. She saw him for the first time from her window. He arrived in a single car with 2 others following behind, a small party for someone of his standing, which told her something. He stepped out without looking around the way powerful men often do, without performing his arrival. He simply got out of the car and walked toward the entrance like he had somewhere to be, and knew exactly where it was. He was tall, dark-haired, unhurried in a way that felt different from patience, more like someone for whom hurrying had simply never been necessary. Seraphine wrote down, "Does not need to perform authority. Has it." Then she closed her notebook and went to find something to read. Ack. The formal dinner was 3 days into his stay. Seraphine had been told to attend, which meant she was told to sit quietly at the long table and look like evidence that the Ironclaw Pack kept its arrangements civilized. She understood her role. She sat, and she listened, and she watched. The conversation was political. Trade access, border agreements, resource sharing along the northern territories. It was the kind of conversation she had sat in on dozens of times as a mediator, and she found herself listening, not with boredom, but with the old professional interest that never quite turned off. At one point, Kane said something about the Eastern Corridor trade laws that was subtly but significantly incorrect. Not a lie, exactly. More like a version of the truth that served a particular conclusion. Seraphine recognized it because she had read the original treaty documents herself, 3 years ago, for a case that had hinged on exactly this kind of careful misreading. She did not plan to speak, but the words were already leaving her mouth before she had made a decision about them. "That reading of the corridor clause applies only to primary routes," she said, evenly, addressing the center of the table rather than anyone in particular. Secondary routes were excluded from the amendment in the revision. The original language still stands. There was a silence. Kane's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes went sharp. Across the table, Calum Draveth looked at her. Not quickly, not with surprise. He looked at her the way someone looks at something they have been waiting to see. "Your name?" he said. "She is," Kane began. "I asked her," Calum said. Not loudly, not unkindly, just with the flat certainty of someone who had not yet said anything he did not mean. The table was very quiet. Seraphine met the Lycan King's eyes. They were dark and steady and gave nothing away, and she felt something she could not immediately name. Not fear, not quite. Something older, something that felt, uncomfortably, like recognition. "Seraphine," she said. "My name is Seraphine Voss." He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he returned to the conversation, and the dinner continued, and nothing was said again about the corridor clause. But when the evening was ending, and the guests were standing, and Seraphine was preparing to return to her room, Calum passed behind her chair. He did not stop. He did not make a scene, but as he passed, he said, very quietly, meant only for her, "You are not supposed to be here." She stared at the table in front of her for a moment, after he had gone. Then she went upstairs, and wrote down what he had said, and underlined it twice. He found reasons to extend his stay. She recognized them for what they were. The negotiations were genuinely complex. That much was true. But a man who ran an entire northern territory could have sent representatives if he had wanted to leave. He did not want to leave. He spoke to her 3 more times in the following week, always briefly, always in places that were naturally explainable. The library, once. The garden, once. A hallway near the translation office, when Kane sent her to verify a document. Each time, the conversation was short. Each time, it was entirely honest. She was the one who said it plainly first. They were in the library. She had been there first. He had come in and taken a book from the far shelf and sat down without asking, and after a comfortable silence, she had looked up and said, "If you are building toward something, I need you to say what it is." He looked up from his book. "What do you think I am building toward?" "I don't know," she said. "That's why I'm asking." He was quiet for a moment. Then he set the book down and looked at her with the same directness she had seen at the dinner table, and said, "I want you to leave this place. I am trying to find the way to make that possible, that gives you the most control over it." Seraphine looked at him for a long time. She thought about hope and what it cost when it was wrong. "I won't be something you rescue and then own differently," she said. "I know," he said, and then, without any drama, "I wasn't planning to own you at all. I was planning to ask what you wanted." He reached into his jacket and placed a folded document on the table between them. She opened it. It was a legal filing, clean, properly formatted, citing specific violations of interpack protection law. It listed the terms of her transfer, the absence of her consent, the misclassification of the arrangement in the treaty language. It was thorough. It was airtight. It had his witness credentials at the bottom, waiting for her signature. "I've been building the case for 11 days, he said. "It holds. If you sign, the filing goes to Regional Council by morning. You would have legal grounds to walk out before noon." She read through it a second time. It was exactly what she would have written. It was, frankly, slightly better than what she would have written, because he had included a precedent citation she had not thought of. She picked up the pen and signed her name. The Ironclaw Alpha tore up the copy delivered to the estate and sent back the pieces in an envelope. It was a significant mistake in judgment. Calum did not respond with anger. He responded with patience, which turned out to be much worse. He began, quietly and methodically, to remove every support beam the Ironclaw Empire stood on. It did not look like war. It looked like business. Trade agreements between the Ironclaw Pack and their eastern partners were quietly revisited. Certain financial arrangements that had relied on Calum's indirect support were allowed to expire. Territories that Ironclaw had claimed through agreements Calum had previously not challenged were now challenged, with documentation, in the proper legal forums. The Ironclaw Alpha had built his power over 30 years. Calum had spent 11 days studying how it worked. He knew exactly which threads to pull. 6 weeks later, the Alpha came to negotiate. He sat across from Calum in a small room, and did not look like a man who tore up legal documents anymore. Calum's terms were simple. The filing would be honored. A public acknowledgement of the treaty violation would be signed. No other terms were offered. The Alpha signed. Seraphine was not in that room. She was at the Regional Interpack Council, standing at the front of a formal session, presenting a legal argument she had spent 2 weeks preparing. The argument was about closing the specific legal language that had made her transfer possible in the first place, a gap in the treaty code that had allowed packs to classify people as diplomatic offerings. She had found it, documented it, and was now presenting the case for a formal amendment. She spoke for 40 minutes. She was asked questions she had expected, and some she had not. She answered all of them. When she sat down, the chair of the session said it was the most clearly argued filing on interpack protection law he had seen in a decade. The amendment passed. Afterward, she drove to her father's house. She sat across from him at the same kitchen table she had grown up at, and she said everything she had decided to say, not with cruelty, but with complete honesty. She told him what his choice had cost her. She told him what she had learned about herself in the months since. She told him she was not going to hold the anger forever, but she was not going to release it on a timeline that was convenient for him. He said he was sorry, and she believed him, and it was not enough yet, and she said that too. Then she left. Delum was outside, leaning against the fence at the edge of the property with his hands in his pockets, looking at the sky. He had not come inside. He had not hovered. He had simply come, in case she wanted company on the drive back, and waited at an entirely reasonable distance. "How are you?" he asked when she reached him. "Angry," she said, "and okay, both at the same time." "That's the most honest answer," he said. They stood there for a moment in the cold air, and it was quiet, the way things are quiet when nothing needs to be said to fill the space. She had, in the months since the filing, built a life in the Northern Reach. She had an office. She had cases. She had a reputation, growing steadily, as someone who knew interpack law better than most of the people who had been practicing it for decades. She had chosen that life, chosen that location, chosen every part of it with clear eyes. She had also, quietly, with very little discussion, chosen him. On the winter ridge above the Northern Reach, the night the first snow came, they stood and looked out over the dark land and the lights far below, and she thought about everything the last year had been. "You dismantled an empire," she said. "Strategically," he said, "and legally. It was mostly paperwork." She laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her by the absolute flatness of his delivery. He looked at her, and there was something in his expression that he did not often show, and did not need to perform, something simple and permanent. She had been sold once, by someone who was supposed to protect her, to people who wanted to own her. She was not sold again. She was not rescued either, not exactly, because you could not rescue someone who had already started saving herself. What she was, standing on that ridge in the first snow of winter, was free, and she had gotten there on her own 2 feet, with her name signed in her own hand, and that made all the difference.